He has interviewed a geisha, a sumo wrestler, Abe's wife for the At Lunch with FT, and also the granddaughter of Tojo. So that's probably great food for fodder. He also wrote this book on Abenomics while he was continuing to do his job for the most part. So how he did that one is also fascinating. Anyway, I will leave it to David Pilling, and we'll have questions and answers at the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara. Actually, my book isn't really about Abenomics, and I'm not really going to talk much about my book today, but Penguin would never forgive me if I didn't wave it around, tell you that it's available to be bought out there, and tell you that I will sign it. And to quote Shinzo Abe for the first and only time today, buy my Abenomics. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes. Actually, this is my clock. So I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes and leave some time for Q&A. As I said, I'm going to talk mainly about the economy. But I also am going to spend at least 5 minutes, I hope, I'll have time to just talk about the geopolitical situation. And of course, if questions come up about that, then I very much relish talking about that. Abenomics or Abegeddon. The first of these are both economist covers. And the first of these, Gaimasho, which is the Japanese foreign ministry, they love to wave around abroad. And Abe literally said, buy my Abenomics, Japan is back. And this is the cover that they wave around. They don't much like the second one, where he's sort of plummeting towards the ground. And this is, what Abenomics is, and I'll go into the more detail in a minute. It's nothing if it's not an experiment. So we actually don't quite know how it will end. And anyone that tells you they do, I think, there's an element of chutzpah there. But I think in order to talk about Abenomics, we need to go back a bit to the past. Why do we need Abenomics? Do we need Abenomics? This is a picture from the book, but I don't want you to concentrate on Murakami Haruki, the Japanese novelist here. The purpose of this slide is the cat. So why am I talking about a cat? Well, when I moved to Tokyo in 2002, the beginning of 2002, Japan was in the midst of deflation. And deflation is a very strange phenomenon that we don't really have much experience of in a modern economy outside Japan. So in the book, I wanted to try to explain what deflation was and what it did. So when I moved into my house in a place called Higashikitazawa, in the house was a fridge, and in the fridge was an envelope, and on the envelope was written the words cat money, and in the envelope was 30,000 yen, and it transpired that this money was for next door neighbors to feed the cat when the owner of the house was away, and they'd forgotten it in the fridge. So I discerned two things from this cat money. The first thing was, it is really expensive to feed a cat in Japan. This was $250. Yeah. This is a tuna-only cat. The second thing, which I hope slightly more profound, is that the fridge was the best investment in Japan at the time. So I did a calculation. This is because of deflation. So I did a calculation. If you'd have put 100,000 yen in the fridge in 1995 and taken that money out in 2012, that would be worth about 112,000 yen. That's applying a fairly kind of standard measure of deflation. If you'd have put that money in the stock market, where of course all smart people put their money in the stock market, it would have halved in value over that same period to 50,000 yen. So what about the bank? Well, the interest rate when I arrived in Japan was 0.01%. So if you'd put your money in the bank, it would have been worth roughly 112,000 yen, but you'd have had the inconvenience of going to the bank and back, taxi fares, bank charges. So the fridge in 2002 was your best investment. And that shows that deflation is at the very least, a very odd phenomenon. And Martin Wolf, my esteemed colleague, he calls deflation a sorcerer's apprentice of debt, a machine for making a bad situation worse. In normal circumstances, if you take out a loan, that loan gets relatively smaller and smaller, easier and easier to repay because your salary goes up, prices go up, revenue goes up, etc. So the loan taken out in the past just diminishes year by year. In deflation, of course, exactly the opposite pertains. So the idea of investing, of spending, both of those are kind of curtailed by deflation, because why would you when the economy is going to be smaller next year, smaller the year after, smaller the year after? This is a chart of this, and Japan is the red line. Now, if Japan were, so this is nominal GDP. If Japan were a heart patient, you would need to be calling the priest about now, yeah? Because Japan has died. It's gone absolutely nowhere in 20 years. Nominal GDP has just not moved. In the same period, there's this very faint line that you might be able to see, which is Germany. The German economy has doubled in size. I should stress this is in nominal terms. The US and the UK are up by 2.5 times. So, one consequence of that is this. So, gross government debt as a percentage of GDP shoots up because GDP, of course, has gone nowhere. And if you imagine that GDP had gone up in the same amount that that the US and the UK had gone up, then that debt line would be a flat line. Now that's gone up because nominal GDP has been flat, because the government has tried to spend more to counteract. This is the stimulus that they've, the bridges to nowhere that people talk about, that they've been spending on all those years. And this is because tax revenue has fallen quite dramatically in Japan since 1990. In nominal terms, tax revenue has actually gone down. So why? Well, one of the things like inheritance tax goes down because your house isn't worth as much, your stocks aren't worth as much. So nominal GDP has all, when it goes nowhere, deflation, in other words, has these pernicious effects. But there's a different story, and anyone who has lived in Japan knows that there is a different story. So I remember an MP, a member of parliament, coming to Japan when I was there. And we went for a walk through, one of the kind of nice areas, and the place was teeming. There were lights, there were thousands of people all over the place. All these restaurants, Michelin-star restaurants, lines up outside, impossible to get in. The place is just buzzing, And he said, if this is a recession, I want one. And this is the other story of Japan here. So if you look at real GDP per person, i.e. stripping out deflation and stripping out the fact that Japan's population hasn't been growing, then Japan doesn't look so bad. It's a little bit lower, and maybe over the long term that would be bad. It's a little bit lower, but it's not much. It's not performing much worse than Germany, the US, and the UK on that measure. Here's another measure, productivity. We always hear that Japanese productivity is very sluggish. It's not going anywhere. That's not borne out by the numbers. So this is OECD numbers, productivity according to PPP ratio. I won't go into that, but basically kind of like for like. You see Japanese productivity is the same as the UK, certainly lower than the US, but higher than the miracle economy Germany, much better than the not quite so miracle economy Italy, where productivity has actually been shrinking. Here's another chart that shows that Japan may be not as terrible as we kind of have been led to believe. I just totted up the number of companies by revenue, not by profits, and by profits Japan may not have done as well, but by revenue. Last year, in the top 500. So Japan still has 56 companies that are in the top 500 by revenue in the world. China 73. Of course, a lot of those are state-owned companies. The US 125. You'd expect that. Then Germany 30, a lot lower. UK 22. And this is the intolerable debt burden, which doesn't look so bad if you look at it on how much does Japan actually have to pay each year to service its debt. Because, of course, it costs practically nothing to service Japanese debt because you can borrow at extraordinarily low interest rates. So at this point, you'd be justified in asking, so why on earth do we need Abenomics? What was wrong with deflation? And there is a case to be made that Japan has been in this kind of deflationary equilibrium. And maybe this could go on forever. Who knows? But there are problems to that. I mean, could debt as a percentage of GDP doubled to 500%, doubled again to 1,000, doubled again to 2,000. We don't know, we've never done it. But you might think that this is a story with an unhappy ending. And then animal spirits, animal spirit, this is back to the fridge in a sense. So Japanese banks could lend. Their balance sheets are very, very healthy. That's why there was no banking crisis in Japan. But what they've been doing is shrinking their balance sheets for the last 15 years. So credit in the economy has gone down by 40%. Again, that doesn't look like a happy story. And companies are awash with money in aggregate. So they've built up these huge savings worth 50% of GDP. So again, they could be investing. They could be being taxed. There's money there in the economy. It's just stuck on the balance sheets of companies. Now, I went to see Kuroda, the governor of the Bank of Japan, in December, and he basically went through. He didn't mention a fridge, but he was sort of talking about the same things. And I just would direct your attention to number 4. So he says this is not good for innovation. This is not good for risk-taking. In a sense, this is not good for the future. Deflation. This is not good for youth. So Abe has come to the conclusion, and I might talk about this a little bit later as to what the motivations are, but he's come to the conclusion that something has to change, that Japan needs to take a big gamble to get out of deflation. So what is that big gamble? Well, this is it. These are the so-called 3 arrows. And if you don't know the story, this is a story from the shogunate age of Japan, when a local daimyo, who happens to come from the same place where Abe conducts his politics in Yamaguchi-ken, said to his sons, the 3 sons, it's a real King Lear story, if you go out and you fight and you're not together, you'll be defeated, you'll lose our great name. And he compared this to arrows. If you have 1 arrow, you can snap it, but put 3 arrows together and you can't bend it. And the idea of Abenomics is supposedly that these 3 arrows will be fired simultaneously. Now, I have a slightly different take on Abenomics, but let me just go through very quickly what it is. So it's fiscal flexibility. Now, you'll often see that written in the press, which of course is never to be trusted, as fiscal stimulus. In Japan, actually, that's not true, because there was fiscal stimulus followed this year very much by fiscal contraction. So what's going to happen this year is that consumption tax is going to go up by 5%, by 3 percentage points, from 5% to 8%. So that's a very sharp contraction. And indeed, this is something that anybody who's interested in the Japanese economy needs to be watching very carefully. There are advisors to Abe who advised him on Abenomics, who told me that this is a disaster and should not be done. Because if you're trying to reflate the economy, get out of deflation for the first time in 20 years, the last thing you kind of want to be able to be doing is to be pulling money out of people's pockets. So there's a potential problem with this policy. The second is monetary stimulus. Now, to me, this is the real potent arrow. This says we're going to double the monetary base. We're going to set an inflation target of 2%, and we will hit it. Or Kuroda, the man who's in charge of the Bank of Japan, will be fired. I mean, this is very, he'll commit suicide. I mean, this is very, figuratively, I hope. This is, we will hit this target. And the reason why this is different is because for 15, 20 years, the people at the Bank of Japan have basically been saying the following: deflation is something we don't understand. We can't get out of it by monetary policy means. Over to you, government. And so there's been this kind of defeatist attitude. Now, whether or not Abenomics will work or not, it is certainly different, because the policy now is, yes, we can, in a sense. We can defeat deflation, and this is how we're going to do it. And the third is structural reform, which I may get a chance to talk about. This is the so-called third arrow. Now, many people outside Japan and some inside think the third arrow is the crucial arrow. I don't think so. If there's time, I'll talk about that. I can certainly talk about that in Q&A. Of course, reform is important, improving productivity is important, but the crucial arrow for me is number 2. Now, my editor made, I think, a very astute comment. He said what Abenomics has done is to change the weather. So even before Kuroda came into the Bank of Japan and did policies like saying they were going to double the monetary base and actually beginning to buy bonds and all of that. Before that ever happened, this is what happened. The yen began to weaken and the stock market began to shoot up. Really just on the announcement, just on the, on the government saying, we can do this. And of course, the other thing about Abe is that he will be there. He'll be there for 4 years. Until 2016, and maybe even beyond. And this is very unusual in Japan. Really, in the last 30 years, you've had Nakasone, who was around for several years, 6 years, and Koizumi, who was around for 5.5 years. Apart from that, Japanese prime ministers come, with the sort of frequency of cherry blossom. They're not so beautiful, but they last about as long. But Abe will be there, and this is very important for Abenomics. Now, this is the third area. I'm not going to talk about that. I was going to skip that, but I'll leave you with a thought that I don't think is as important as everybody else thinks it is. So what could go wrong? This is Abegeddon, really. This is the Abegeddon scenario. Now, this rather peculiar chart is something that I had made up. It comes from another colleague of mine who wrote that it's a little bit like pulling a brick. Getting out of deflation is a bit like pulling a brick with an elastic band. You may pull and pull and pull, and it's very hard to budge. But then when it does budge, maybe it will leap. So the fear of Abenomics is that this will all overshoot horribly, that you'll get hyperinflation, that interest rates, which, as I say, have been very, very low, will spike. Now, if interest rates suddenly shot up, that could have two consequences. So if you're asking me Abenomics or Abegeddon, I think Abegeddon is unlikely. I don't rule it out, but I think it's unlikely. So that's my answer to my own question. But it could happen. Now, if interest rates spike, that means that bond prices would fall because they move in reverse directions. And the banks have lots of bonds. So one fear is that banks would suddenly become bankrupt overnight because their balance sheets would be shot to hell. Now, I think this is very unlikely. For a number of reasons. Banks have actually got rid of a lot of their bonds and bought equities, and some of them did very well last year because equities shot up. They have shortened the maturity on their bonds, so that puts them in a much better position. So I think and of course they can make, if the economy is doing well, which would tend to be the reason why rates are shooting up, then they'll make money other ways with the spread from borrowing and lending rates. So I think the banks thing is overdone. Some local banks could come in difficulty, but I think they would just simply be merged or bought up by the bigger banks. So I wouldn't expect a systemic problem. The government is a slightly different matter. The government at the moment spends about 14 or 15% of the total budget servicing debt. That's just servicing the interest rates on the debt. If interest rates doubled, well, that would be 30%. If they trebled, that would be 45%. You could see how this could get quite difficult quite quickly. There is what some people call a narrow path. Fiscal dominance. This is really that the government will know that the Bank of Japan is willing to buy any amount of debt, so they'll just spend ludicrously what they want to, and that this will lead to a kind of Weimar Republic hyperinflation. If any of you have met members of Japan's Ministry of Finance, I think this is unlikely. These guys are very, very conservative. They've been talking about the debt blowing up for 25 years. They once told me that if you piled up all Japan's debt, it would be 14,000 times higher than Mount Fuji, which I thought was a very odd thing to go and work out. So these guys are, they're on the case. So I don't think this is going to happen. Capital flight, this would be people would lose faith in the yen. They'd send all their money abroad. Again, I think this is unlikely. You've got pension funds, life assurance companies, all their liabilities, the money they have to pay out, is going to be in yen. To take that kind of currency risk by sending the money abroad, I don't see a huge outflow. So I think much more dangerous is that this will fizzle out. And how could it fizzle out? Well, at the moment, you have quite good inflation numbers in Japan. So you've gone from negative, from deflation for the last 15 years to now inflation. So the headline rate is 1.6%. That looks quite good. Strip out energy prices, fresh food prices, and it doesn't look so pretty. It's 0.6% plus. So it's still much, much better than it's been. But again, a lot of that inflation is really coming from importing inflation via higher energy prices because your yen is weaker. And because of the way these things work, if that's all there is, then in a year's time, this will simply wash out of the system because the comparison will be with last year. You'll no longer get that bump from the deflated yen and the higher imported prices, and it will go back to zero again. So what you need to get this going is you need wages to rise, you need demand to rise. And remember, demand is going to take a hit because of the consumption tax going up. Wages, you've got very cautious companies out there, and although the big companies may be arm wrestled into increasing wages, smaller companies less so. They have very thin margins. On the plus side, the unemployment has gone down to about 3.7%. The job-to-job seekers ratio is 1-to-1, very tight labour market. And there are some areas, construction, where you cannot find workers, truck drivers, you cannot find workers, even people in shops. So you could see a kind of a pressure for wages to rise. But it's definitely a watch this space. And if they don't rise, then Abenomics, I think, is in trouble. Fiscal sustainability. This is just over the long term. Can Japan sustain its debt? I've got some charts. It shows that Abenomics will have to work. You'll have to get inflation of 2% plus real growth of a percentage point. So that's 3% nominal growth for many, many years. And then you begin to turn a corner on the fiscal debt, on the fiscal situation, the public debt. So again, that's something that this doesn't solve Japan's debt problem overnight. Now, demographics. Let me just go to the next chart. I think that there's a good chance that Abenomics will work. I'm not predicting it will work, but you know, there is a reasonable chance that you will get to sustainably higher inflation, whether it's 2% or 1.5%, you know, who knows, but sustainably higher inflation. And that will be, if it happens, if it works, a much better position from which to deal with all Japan's other problems, like demographics. But even if you get to that position, you can't print babies. And Japan's fertility rate is about 1.4. To sustain a population, it needs to be 2.1. So inflation doesn't solve that basic problem. It's possible that the Japanese will be more likely to have babies in an inflationary environment than in a deflationary one. You can make that argument. But we don't know that. It's never been done. Just in parentheses, I should say that Japan is joined by many other countries that have fertility rates that are below replacement value. In fact, there are 66 in the world, and in 20 years' time, the whole world will be at replacement value. So Japan is not this isolated, weird, shrinking place that we tend to think. If Japan's shrinking, then so are other places, including Hong Kong, although, of course, it's got that big place north of here attached, so maybe it'll be just fine. You can't print nuclear power stations that work, or you can't print public opinion that accepts nuclear power stations to work. And Japan switched off all its power stations after the Fukushima disaster, and so it imports all its energy now. It imported much of it before, but it imports all of it now, and that's having a deleterious effect on the trade deficit, and even on and it's even running a current account deficit. For the short term, I don't know, that's a big problem. If that continued indefinitely, I think it would be. So printing doesn't help that. You need policy, in other words. You can't print a feminist revolution in Japan. And I think that that's what Japan needs. People talk about improving the female participation rate. The female participation rate in the workforce is actually not as low as people think. So the gains to be had from shoving lots of women into low-paid jobs for the kind of macroeconomic benefit of that is actually quite limited. What would not be limited, in my opinion, is to bust through that glass ceiling, is to get women into fantastic jobs, is to allow women, and we want women to do it all now. We want them to have babies, look after old people, work and improve the GDP, pay tax and all of that. So if they're to do it all, I think they need to have it all. So I think, you know, you need a kind of women's revolution. You need women to be able to bust through that glass ceiling, to have fantastic jobs, and to have be able to have kids and to take as much time as they want off work and then to go back and still have careers. You know, and there's a huge question mark over that. Anyone who knows Japan, will that really happen? You know, Abe talks a good game, but, you know, some of the people he appoints have opinions that would be better suited to the 1850s than the 1950s, let alone the 2050s, you know. So I am skeptical, and you certainly can't print that. And there's many other things that Japan ought to do if it's going to get its economy really humming again, that you can't print. So in other words, Abenomics could, if it works, which is a big if, improve the situation, but it's not going to solve all Japan's problems. I don't think you really needed me to tell you that, but I'm telling you anyway. Let me end on this chart, because the geopolitics, I think, is important. I'll spend about 5 minutes talking about this, and then maybe we could go into some Q&A. So this is a horrible phrase, and I do apologize for it. History is a rotting corpse at the bottom of the diplomatic garden. It happens to be my phrase. It's in the book, and I liked it so much I put it on this chart. But of course, you can describe history in geopolitical terms, as indeed I do. I have another chart where I talk about Senkaku Diaoyu and, you know, the US pivots and all of that stuff. But another way of looking at this is as a kind of family feud. And here are 3 pictures of 3 leaders in Northeast Asia. And of course, I could have added Kim Jong-un, father Kim Jong-il, grandfather Kim Il-sung. And what did Kim Il-sung do? He fought the Japanese. So let's go to the other 3 pictures. So Shinzo Abe, his grandfather was Kishi. So Kishi ran at one point Manchuria. Kishi ran the Japanese industry in the 1930s and 40s. And guess what the Japanese industry was producing then? It wasn't fridges and air conditioning units. It was weapons. So, you know, he was in charge of the war economy. Abe, who was arrested at the end of the war as a would-be Class A war criminal by the Americans, who then, for various reasons, because they were more scared of communism than they were of these guys, let him out, exonerated him. He then became Prime Minister of Japan and signed the re-signing of the US-Japan Security Treaty, and actually brought the Olympics to Japan. So very interesting family background. Abe's autobiography begins with him sitting on Kishi's knee in 1960 when there were demonstrations against the US-Japan Security Treaty, and his grandfather was explaining to him why this was a good thing to do. And part of Abe's psyche, I think, is to kind of exonerate his grandfather, to build on what he sees as his grandfather's legacy. You know, the idea that he's branded an almost Class A war criminal is something that Abe feels very deeply. So there's Abe's kind of personal history. So let's go to Park Geun-hye, whose father, Park Chung-hee, came into power the early 60s, 62, I think, in a coup, launched the Miracle on the Han River, an extraordinary economic catch-up, largely modeled on Japan, but done in a much more compressed time span. He was also called Takagi Masao, because, guess what? He fought in the Imperial Army of Japan. He swore an allegiance to the emperor because Japan was occupied. South Korea was a Japanese colony for 35 years. And so, if you wanted to use a word, you could call him, if you wanted to, a collaborator. This is a very hard legacy for the daughter, and I think this is one of the reasons why she is now being so tough on Abe. So she's not talking to Abe, yeah? So what about this next guy, Xi Jinping? Is he talking to Abe? Well, of course not. So who's his father? Xi Jong-sun. What did he do? He was in Yan'an, set up the communist base, fighting the Japanese. Then, in his later career, Guangdong province. He was in charge of Guangdong province, which was the province of opening and reform, the great Deng Xiaoping experiment that turned into the modern China that we know. And of course, as Mao and Deng Xiaoping didn't, they certainly didn't talk that much about Japan and Japan's invasion. But as they began to open up, and as the kind of communist ideology lost its potency, other ideologies came in, and one of them was nationalism. And nationalism means partly Taiwan, and it means partly, largely, you could argue, Japan. So in a way, these guys are fighting the battles that their fathers and grandfathers fought. And I think that's very potent. And in a sense, history normally begins to kind of fade away. And the interesting, in a sense, very upsetting thing about history in Northeast Asia is that the further we get away from the events of the 1930s and 1940s, the more potent these things become. And just to end, if you just talk about Abe and Xi Jinping, so I think that Abe would not be Prime Minister of Japan now if it hadn't been for the rising tension with China. He had a disastrous first go at the prime ministership. I think he would not have been given a second chance. But the fact that he was a nationalist, which was definitely a point against him when he was first prime minister, kind of becomes a point for him. He's this strong guy that maybe can defend Japan. And I think that, I will write stories because I'm now a columnist, so I meant to, voice my opinion. So I and others in the FT will write about Abe, concentrate on economics. We need a Japanese economy that's functioning, but forget all this nationalist nonsense. That's basically our kind of message. But in a sense, I think that's not realistic because in a sense, I think the two are two sides of the same coin. And the reason that Abe has decided to kind of go for it, to try and rejuvenate the Japanese economy, is because of his concerns, his fears about China and his desire, misplaced or not, to build a stronger economy and what he sees as a Japan that's able to, defend itself and in a sense puff itself up in the world. Because that Japan that was flatlining doesn't look like a Japan that you take very seriously. It looks like a Japan that's sinking into the sea. And there is a phrase, fukoku kyohei, which means rich nation, strong army, which, like so many things in Japan, comes from China. It comes from the Warring States period in China. And this was the rallying cry of the Meiji Restoration, the modernization of Japan. Rich economy, strong army. Now, Japan didn't have a rich economy, or it had an economy that looked as though it was going nowhere because of deflation. And I think that's why Abe has really gritted his teeth and decided to take this big gamble. And in a sense, it means that it's more likely to work than if he wasn't 100% committed to it, which I think he is. There's still a big if over it. You couldn't rule out Abegeddon. But there is a geopolitical kind of motivating force as well as, pure economics. So I'll leave it there. I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
David, thanks very much. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. If you want to raise your hand and give us your name and organization if you're with one. Who wants to start? Well, I'll get it going then.
Wow, a silent room full of journalists. I've never seen such a thing.
Pause for thought. Interesting how at the end you talk about geopolitics and describe Abe and what drives him. Is he the one who is really driving? Is it a personal Abe at the forefront of everything that's happening in Japan, or does he have a core team? How is it all
there is a
evolving?
core team. I mean, this is almost like an A-level examination question, isn't it? Does history produce leaders, or do leaders drag history along? I think Abe is kind of the leader that, that Japan has turned to. I mean, we wrote a leader about Abe recently, and there was this phrase in the leader that people kind of held their nose and voted for Abe. And I think there's a big sort of slab of the Japanese population that feels quite uncomfortable with Abe the nationalist, but which kind of thinks we need Abe the guy who's going to revive the economy. And the nationalist stuff is more palatable in Japan now than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago because of concerns about China. I mean, it's all quite depressing, but if you look at, there was a Pew opinion poll that came out recently. If you go back and look at those Pew polls, in the 60s and 70s, if you ask the Japanese, who's your favorite nation? It's almost inconceivable now to think of it. They all said China. For a number of reasons. China wasn't very threatening back then. It had panda bears. Obviously, a lot of Japanese culture comes from China. It's, you know, I mean, you know, and the Japanese are aware of that. And you know, there are a number of socialists in Japan that even kind of thought this is a cool experiment that we'd like to see work. So for an amalgam of reasons, now 5% have a favorable impression of China. And of course, it's completely, you know, there's a mirror image. So 6% of Chinese have a favorable impression of Japan. So I think these things have kind of, you know, come together to create an environment in which Abe can exist and be popular. Because last time he was in power, you know, he was brought in by the LDP. It's a parliamentary system, so people don't vote for the prime minister. The LDP was in power. They nominated Abe. So he was kind of foisted on the Japanese opinion. But his opinion polls just absolutely tanked almost immediately. And he was kicked out, you know, kind of in disgrace 11, 12 months later. You know, Abe Mark II is much more popular. His opinion ratings have held up very strongly. They're 55%, you know, a year into office after all sorts of things have gone on. So as I say, I think these things have kind of come together, you know.
Robin?
David, excellent talk, and I really look forward to the book. Congratulations. Your talk at the end really made me think, because it seems to me that North Asia is the first time we have a geopolitical test of rising China's power and the reaction to it. How likely do you think it is that we will see a military conflict in the next 5 years?
In the next 5 years? If you said the next 5 years, I'd say, you know, it's a very dangerous period, but probably not. You know, I mean, there's this old thing, I don't think either China or Japan want a military conflict. And the fact that America's there, I think, as the referee, means they can really heighten the rhetoric. They can shout at each other an awful lot. They can be push and counter-push. And I actually think Abe kind of likes Xi Jinping in power. And as much as he thinks about it, I think Xi Jinping probably likes Abe there because they can push against each other. So I think they can raise the stakes because America's there as the referee. Of course, that has its own dangers, because raising the stakes, raising the rhetoric, means that the chance of an accident is higher. And there could be an accident. There could be, you know, wings of planes could clip. Someone could do something stupid around the Senkaku Diaoyu, shoot someone, push someone in the sea. Someone could land on the island. Someone else could, you know, you can think of the scenarios. For it to become a real, you know, for China to kind of march in and say, we're taking these back, I think would take a kind of an economic crisis in China. Personally, you know, it's possible, but I don't expect that. So I think you probably just about get away with it. But just to complete this, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Japan is kind of it's in a doubly bad position, because Japan is America's unsinkable aircraft carrier in Asia at a time when China is rising and America is kind of thinking, oh, can the post-war order, when we treated the Pacific, including the Western Pacific, as our lake. That's not my words, that's the words of a former US Defense Secretary. Can that really continue? You know, the Americans had the Monroe Doctrine in 1830 when they said, get out of our backyard to Europe. And the backyard was quite a big backyard. It was South America and Central America. Now, the Chinese, I don't think, are going to say to America, get out of the Western Pacific. But they might well say, they don't need to say it, but they might well act as though, you know, the situation where they're kind of penned in against their coastline, where America's spying all along the coast with planes and submarines and whatever, that is no longer tenable, and they're not going to tolerate that anymore. And Japan sits on that fault line. But Japan is also Japan. So it's America's representative, and it's also Japan. It's the little brother that went and invaded and did all sorts of atrocious things in China that have not been forgiven. So it's kind of in a doubly difficult position. I have no idea how this is going to end, but what I would say is I doubt very much whether the status quo will hold. So it's how we get from here to there when we don't quite know what there is. I don't know what there is. So that's how I would describe it.
We had a question right here.
Hi, I was just wondering, in the beginning you were talking about the development of the economy in Japan, or lack thereof, and I was wondering whether the malaise that Japan's going through now is something that we also see in big patriarchal family-style run organizations. Is this just part of the problems that are endemic to what could be an aging economy?
There's quite a lot in that question. I mean, what I would say, I guess, is that I think Japan was very good at catch-up. So it was very good at what I call an analog economy. It was very good at manufacturing stuff, at taking an American car and making it better, or making it quicker, or making it cheaper, but still better. You know, and it was very good at all of that stuff. And that was really what Japan's post-war catch-up was based on. You know, engineering, you know, if you want to call that patriarchal, I mean, you know, probably overwhelmingly male. State planning, in my opinion, you know, very clever state planning, actually. You know, state planning is not necessarily very fashionable, but the Japanese did it, the Taiwanese did it, the South Koreans did it, and to some extent the Chinese have done it. And it's actually worked quite well. That becomes, all of the things that allowed Japan to catch up become slightly less attractive and useful once you've caught up or nearly caught up. It didn't quite catch up with American living standards, it did catch up with European ones. And of course, you've also had, at that same period, you've had a change in how economies work from, you know, what you could call a manufacturing to, or an analog economy, to what you could call a digital economy. So take Sony, the classic case. So Sony was very good at making Walkmen, it was very good at making TVs. You know, it was the prime electronics company in the world. It had all the technology to make an iPod or an iPhone. But the Japanese never did. And why? Well, because they weren't really connected to the rest of the world, because they kind of, you know, their own market was good enough, so they dominated their domestic market. So you had cameras on phones years before Americans or British had cameras on phones, but they were only in Japan, and they never really bothered. You know, they didn't have much, they don't have the English skills, sort of not connected, open systems, that kind of thing. Now, to go back to your patriarchal thing, do I think that Japanese women may be better at dealing with some of those issues than Japanese men? Yeah, possibly. I think it'd be worth a try. So changing organizations to bring in more women, to bring in fresh ideas, and also to open up to more foreigners, I think would serve Japan very well.
I'm afraid we're running short on time, so we have time for one more question on the veranda from Mark.
Hi, David. Mark Michelson from
Hi,
IMA Asia. How are you, David?
Good.
Very interesting. I'd love to talk to you about Choshu, but we won't get esoteric. Practical. It was sort of a follow-up from what you said before, the demographic situation. Japan doesn't have enough people at the moment to run the economy. They are aging. We all know this. Been very reluctant to let in people for many years. Also, foreign direct investment, it's often negative in Japan, and I know that's not quite indicative, but it still shows an attitude. Is this going to change, and is it important that it changes, or not so important, given in the context you made as the other two arrows?
Well, I think demographics provides a big challenge. I don't think it's as big as a challenge as people say, I would argue. Partly because loads of countries are in the same boat. So Germany has exactly the same fertility rate as Japan, but you very rarely hear about, you know, the kind of German demographic catastrophe. You say, I mean, you'll often hear the same thing in the same sentence. It's terrible that Japan's investing all this money outside the country, because how are they going to create the jobs? And then you'll hear, you know, 5 seconds later, and Japan doesn't have enough people. So how's it going to get people to fill all the jobs? And the two things can't be compatible, yeah? So I think there's a lot of confused thinking about what demographics means. I mean, if you want labor, you can get it in one of two ways. You can bring it in, or you can go out and get it. So the labor problem, and of course Japanese companies have been doing precisely that. So if you look at Japanese M&A, it's actually been far higher than Chinese M&A and outward bound in the last several years, apart from last year where it dipped, maybe because the yen weakened. You know, people talk a lot about the dependency ratio, but if people work longer, then it's not a kind of a mechanical thing. You know, people say the number of 15 to 55-year-olds versus the number over 65 or whatever. But I think people are far too mechanical about this. Now, of course, that does not mean Japan doesn't have huge challenges. The workforce is shrinking by 0.5% a year. The population will go down eventually by about 1 million people a year. It's hardly gone down at all yet, so this is all to come. But it will. It's now 128 million, and it could begin to go down, as I say, by 1 million a year. Now, obviously, that cannot go on indefinitely. If it does, you know, the last Japanese person will turn off the lights, and, you know, that'll be it. And I very much doubt, you know, I reckon people will learn to breed a bit more before that happens. But, you know, can I prove that? Of course not. But my gut tells me that won't happen. And as I say, if Japan has that problem, I think, you know, many other countries do. So I don't buy this story that demographics means the whole place is just going to sink. Just to add one final thought. So when Japan had 45 million people, not that long ago, 1910, and then its population exploded, actually before the war and then to some extent after the war. And of course what people said is, how can Japan have so many people? Such small islands, they'll never fit all those people in. 50 million, 70 million, 100 million, where does it end? Now it's going down a bit, so it peaked at 128, now it's 126.7, I think. Now people are, where are all the people going to come from? I mean, you know, there's not some magic number that Japan needs 128 million people to survive. I agree, if it went down to 45, you'd probably think, oh, you know, this is getting a bit hairy. But I doubt whether that will happen. I mean, the truth is neither of you or I will be around to find out whether I'm right or not. So I confidently predict that this will not happen. I may end there. Thank you very much.